Mom, we'll visit you soon, I promise, my daughter Tori said through the phone, her voice carrying that familiar tone of rushed dismissal I'd grown to recognize over the past 2 years. Things are just crazy with the kids' schedules right now. You know how it is. I held the phone a little tighter, staring out my kitchen window at the empty bird feeder I'd stopped filling weeks ago. Of course, sweetheart, I replied, though something cold settled in my chest. I understand completely. But I didn't understand. Not really. Not when soon had become 6 months ago, and 6 months had stretched into a year of broken promises and last-minute cancellations. The conversation ended the way they all did lately, with Tori suddenly remembering something urgent she had to do, her voice already distant as she said goodbye. I set the phone down on the counter next to the birthday cards I'd bought for my grandchildren 3 months ago, still sitting there because somehow their birthdays had slipped everyone's mind until it was too late to mail them. The silence in my house felt different that day, heavier somehow, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. My name is Eleanor, and at 63, I thought I understood how families worked. I thought I understood my place in the world my children had built around their own families. For 42 years, I'd been the center of holiday gatherings, the grandmother who remembered everyone's favorite cookies, the mother who dropped everything when anyone needed help. I'd raised 3 children, Tori, Thomas, and Jennifer, mostly on my own after their father passed when they were young. I'd worked 2 jobs to put them through college, celebrated every milestone, babysat every grandchild, and somehow convinced myself that this foundation of love and sacrifice would translate into something lasting, something that would keep us connected as they built their own lives. The warning signs had been there for months, maybe longer. Phone calls that used to come weekly became monthly, then sporadic. Holiday invitations that came later each year, with less enthusiasm, as if I were being squeezed into already full schedules rather than being the reason for them. Tori lived 20 minutes away, but might as well have been on another continent. Thomas had moved to Phoenix 2 years ago for his job and called maybe once a month, usually when his wife reminded him. Jennifer, my youngest, had been dealing with her divorce and seemed to have retreated into herself entirely, barely responding to texts and avoiding family gatherings altogether. I'd told myself they were just busy. Modern life was demanding, I reasoned. They had mortgages and soccer practices and work deadlines. They loved me. They were just overwhelmed. I made excuses for every missed call I didn't return, every invitation I didn't receive, every grandchild's event I heard about secondhand through social media posts I wasn't tagged in. I convinced myself that being understanding and patient was what good mothers did. I convinced myself that giving them space meant they'd come back when they were ready. But that phone call with Tori changed something. Maybe it was the way she'd said, "We'll visit you soon," with the same empty tone people use when they say, "We should do lunch sometime," to acquaintances they never intend to see again. Maybe it was the realization that I couldn't remember the last time any of my children had asked me how I was doing, and actually waited for an answer. Or maybe it was just the accumulation of months of feeling like I was bothering them every time I reached out, like I was an obligation rather than someone they genuinely wanted to spend time with. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a bottle of wine, good wine, the kind I usually saved for when company came over, and sat in my living room with a legal pad and pen. I started writing down every interaction I'd had with my children over the past 6 months. Every phone call, every text message, every invitation extended and declined. When I finished, the list was painfully short, and the pattern was unmistakable. I wasn't paranoid or overly sensitive. I wasn't imagining things. My children had slowly, systematically, begun cutting me out of their lives. The next morning, I called Tori back. "Honey," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. I was thinking about what you said yesterday about visiting soon. What would be a good weekend for you? There was a pause, and I could almost hear her scrambling for an excuse. Oh, Mom. Actually, the next few weeks are really packed. Sophie has dance recitals, and Jake's baseball season is starting, and Tom's been working weekends on this big project. The litany of reasons continued, each one perfectly reasonable on its own, but together forming an impenetrable wall of unavailability. What about the weekend after Easter? I pressed gently. Another pause. Actually, we're planning to go to the lake house that weekend. Tom's parents invited us, and the kids are so excited. Tom's parents, her husband's family. The family that apparently had time for weekend getaways while I sat home with birthday cards growing stale on my counter. Of course, I said. That sounds lovely. But something in my chest cracked a little bit more. I tried Thomas next. Phoenix was far away, but surely we could plan something. Hey, Mom, he'd answered, and for a moment my heart lifted at the genuine warmth in his voice. I was just thinking about you. How are things? We chatted for a few minutes about his work, about the kids, about the weather. When I mentioned maybe planning a visit, either him coming here or me going there, his tone shifted. Yeah, absolutely. We should definitely do that soon. Let me talk to Lisa about our schedule and get back to you. But he didn't get back to me. Not that week, not the next week, not the week after that. Jennifer was the hardest to reach. My calls went straight to voicemail, and when I finally got her on the phone, she sounded exhausted and distant. I'm sorry, Mum. I know I've been awful about staying in touch. It's just been really hard with the divorce and everything. I wanted to help, wanted to be there for her, wanted to remind her that this was exactly the kind of time when family should come together. Maybe I could come stay with you for a few days? I offered. Help out with the kids, cook some meals, just be there if you need to talk. The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Mum, that's really sweet. But honestly, I think I need to figure this out on my own right now. You understand, right? I understood. I understood that my offer to help felt like interference. I understood that my presence felt like pressure rather than comfort. I understood that somehow, without realizing it, I had become someone my own children felt they needed to manage rather than someone they turned to for support. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. Spring turned into summer, and the promised visits never materialized. Tori's soon became maybe next month, became things are just so crazy right now, Mum. Thomas stopped mentioning visits altogether, and our conversations became shorter and less frequent. Jennifer missed my birthday entirely, sending a text 2 days late that said, "So sorry, Mum. Hope you had a nice day." I'd spent my birthday alone, eating cake I'd bought for myself while looking through photo albums of birthdays past, when my house used to be full of noise and laughter and the organized chaos of a family celebration. The loneliness wasn't the worst part. I'd been alone before, especially in the years right after my husband died. The worst part was feeling like I was slowly disappearing from the lives of the people who mattered most to me. I watched my neighbors' families come and go, saw grandparents being picked up for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, witnessed the kind of family closeness I'd thought I'd built with my own children. But when I looked at my own life, I saw empty weekends and silent phones, and the growing certainty that if something happened to me, it might be days before anyone noticed. That's when I started thinking about moving. At first, it was just a passing thought, the kind of idle daydream that comes when you're feeling sorry for yourself. What if I just picked up and moved somewhere new? Started over? But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. What was keeping me here? A house full of memories of a family that no longer made time for me? Neighbors who were friendly but not close? A routine built around waiting for phone calls that came less and less frequently? I started researching retirement communities in other states, not nursing homes or assisted living facilities. I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. But active adult communities, where people my age were building new friendships and trying new things, instead of sitting around waiting for their children to remember they existed. I looked at places in North Carolina, Virginia, even Arizona near Thomas, though something told me that proximity wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of children who seemed to have outgrown their need for their mother. The more research I did, the more excited I became. There were communities with book clubs and hiking groups and volunteer opportunities. Places where being 63 meant you were just getting started, not winding down. Places where your value wasn't measured by how often your children called or whether your grandchildren remembered your birthday. For the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness or frustration. I felt possibility. I found a place in Asheville, North Carolina, that felt perfect. A community of active retirees nestled in the mountains, with a clubhouse and walking trails and more activities than I could possibly participate in. The homes were smaller than what I was used to, but they were new and low maintenance and designed for people who wanted to spend their time living rather than cleaning and maintaining. I requested information packets and spoke with sales representatives who painted a picture of a life I'd forgotten was possible, a life where I could be myself, not just someone's mother or grandmother. But before I made any decisions, I decided to give my children one more chance. Maybe I'd been too subtle, too understanding, too willing to accept their excuses. Maybe they didn't realize how much their distance was hurting me. Maybe if I was more direct, more honest about my feelings, we could find a way back to each other. I invited all three of them for Sunday dinner, something I hadn't done in over a year. "I'm making pot roast," I told Tori, knowing it was her favorite. "And I really need to talk to all of you about something important." She sounded surprised but agreed to come. Thomas said he'd try to join by video call from Phoenix, and Jennifer said she'd be there if she could find a babysitter. Sunday came, and I spent the morning cooking and preparing, setting the dining room table with my good china for the first time since Christmas. Tori arrived an hour late, apologizing profusely about traffic and soccer practice running long. Thomas called from Phoenix as promised, his face pixelated on my laptop screen, clearly multitasking during our conversation. Jennifer never showed up at all, texting at the last minute that something had come up with one of her kids. So there I sat, looking at Tori across my carefully set table, while Thomas's distracted face flickered on the computer screen, trying to find the words to explain how lonely I'd become. "I've been thinking," I began carefully, "about how we might spend more time together as a family. I know everyone's busy, but I miss you all so much, and I worry that we're drifting apart." Tori nodded absently while checking her phone, and Thomas asked me to repeat what I'd said because he'd been dealing with something at work. I tried again, more directly this time. "I feel like I hardly see any of you anymore. It's been months since we've all been together, and I can't remember the last time someone called just to chat, not because they needed something." Tori looked up from her phone, clearly uncomfortable. "Mum, we're all dealing with a lot right now. You know how it is with kids and work and everything. We're doing the best we can." Thomas's voice crackled through the computer speaker. "Yeah, Mum. It's not that we don't want to spend time with you. Life is just really demanding right now." But I could see in Tori's eyes that she was already thinking about leaving, already mentally moving on to the next item on her endless to-do list. I could hear in Thomas's voice that he was having this conversation while doing other things, dividing his attention between his mother's loneliness and whatever was happening in his office. This wasn't a family dinner. It was another obligation they were fulfilling with the minimum effort required. What if something happened to me? I asked quietly. What if I fell down the stairs or had a heart attack? How long would it be before someone noticed I was gone? The question hung in the air like smoke, uncomfortable and unavoidable. Tori's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or recognition. Thomas went quiet on the video call, but instead of the conversation I'd hoped for, the honest discussion about how we'd grown apart and what we could do to fix it, I got more of the same. Reassurances that felt hollow, promises that felt empty, and the increasing certainty that my children loved me in theory but had no room for me in practice. Tori left shortly after we finished eating, taking a plate of leftovers and promising to call soon. Thomas signed off to deal with a work emergency that had apparently been brewing during our conversation. I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by dirty dishes and the remnants of a family dinner that had felt more like a business meeting, and made my decision. They'd had their chance to show me that I mattered, that our relationship was worth investing in, that I was more than just a monthly phone call obligation. They'd failed that test completely. The next morning, I called the real estate agent in Asheville and made an offer on a 2-bedroom condo in the retirement community I'd been researching. It was accepted within hours. I called a local real estate agent and put my house on the market. Within a week, I had a cash offer from a young family eager to move into the neighborhood before the school year started. The speed with which everything fell into place felt like confirmation that this was the right decision, that the universe was finally opening doors instead of closing them. I didn't tell my children. Not yet. I wanted to see how long it would take them to notice something was different, to wonder why I wasn't calling as often, to realize that the burden of maintaining our relationship had shifted from my shoulders to theirs. I stopped initiating phone calls and started letting their calls go to voicemail more often. I declined Tori's half-hearted invitation to Jake's baseball game, saying I had other plans. When Thomas called to tell me about a promotion at work, I congratulated him warmly, but didn't ask the follow-up questions that usually extended our conversations. I was polite, loving, but no longer desperate for their attention. The change in their behavior was almost immediate. Tori called twice in 1 week, concerned about why I seemed different lately. Thomas actually called back when I didn't answer his first call, something he hadn't done in months. Even Jennifer reached out, asking if everything was okay because I hadn't been texting her as much. For the first time in years, I was the one with the power in our relationships. I was the one they were worried about losing, rather than the one worried about being forgotten. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and more importantly, I'd gotten a taste of what life could be like when I wasn't constantly trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't prioritize me. I'd started focusing on myself, taking yoga classes, joining a book club at the library, even going on a few coffee dates with men I'd met through online dating sites. At 63, I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under decades of being primarily defined by my role as a mother and grandmother. The moving process was surprisingly liberating. I went through 40 years' worth of accumulated possessions, keeping only what truly mattered and donating or selling the rest. Family photos went into carefully labeled boxes, but I found myself more interested in the future I was creating than in preserving evidence of a past that felt increasingly irrelevant. I kept my grandmother's china, but sold the dining room set, where so many family meals had grown increasingly strained and uncomfortable. I packed my favorite books and gardening tools, but left behind the furniture that held too many memories of feeling invisible in my own home. 3 weeks before my moving date, Tori finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mum, you seem really distracted lately. Is everything okay?" We were having one of our stilted phone conversations, the kind where we updated each other on surface-level news while carefully avoiding anything that might lead to real intimacy or vulnerability. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I replied, and technically it was true. Everything was more than fine. Everything was about to be exactly what I wanted it to be. "It's just that you seem different. Less, I don't know, less available, I guess. Less available. After months of being too available, of always being ready to drop everything for phone calls that never came and visits that never happened, I was finally less available. I've been keeping busy," I told her, which was also true. I'd been busy planning a future that didn't revolve around waiting for my children to remember I existed. Thomas called the next day with similar concerns. "Mum, Tori said you've been acting strange lately. She's worried about you." The fact that they'd discussed me, that Tori had called her brother to express concern about our mother, would have thrilled me 6 months ago. Now it just confirmed what I'd already known. They were capable of making effort when they were worried about losing something, but not capable of making effort to maintain something they took for granted. "I'm not acting strange," I assured him. "I'm just living my life." And for the first time in years, that was completely true. I was living my life for me, not organizing it around the hope that my children might suddenly remember they had a mother who loved them and wanted to be part of their world. Jennifer was the last to call, and her conversation was the most honest. "Mum, I know I've been a terrible daughter lately. The divorce has been so hard, and I've been struggling with depression, and I know I've pulled away from everyone. But Tori said you seem upset with us, and I wanted to make sure you know that I love you, even if I've been bad at showing it." Her words hit differently than her siblings' concerns. There was actual vulnerability there, actual acknowledgement of the distance that had grown between us. But even Jennifer's honesty couldn't undo months of feeling forgotten and dismissed. Her mental health struggles were real, and I had empathy for what she was going through. But that didn't change the fact that she'd chosen to handle those struggles by cutting off contact with the people who loved her most. It didn't change the fact that when I'd offered to help, to be there for her during the hardest time of her life, she'd rejected that offer and chosen to suffer alone rather than let her mother provide support. "I do know you love me," I told her gently, "and I love you too. But love and showing love are different things, and I've spent too many months feeling like I don't matter to any of you. I'm not upset with you, but I am making some changes in my life." She asked what kind of changes, and I almost told her. Almost broke down and explained about the move, about the new life I was building, about the decision I'd made to stop waiting for my children to remember I existed. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the knowledge that once I told one of them, they'd all know within hours, and suddenly I'd be fielding calls and managing their reactions instead of focusing on my own future. "Just some positive changes," I said instead. "I'm trying to focus more on the relationships in my life that are mutual and fulfilling." The words hung between us, and I could almost hear her trying to figure out if that was a criticism of our relationship. It was, but it was also just a statement of fact. 2 weeks before the move, my realtor called with good news and a complication. The buyers wanted to close early and move in immediately, but they needed me to be out of the house within 5 days instead of the 2 weeks we'd originally planned. Under normal circumstances, this would have been stressful, maybe even impossible. But I'd been living like someone preparing to disappear for months now, keeping my possessions minimal and my attachments loose. "That works for me," I told her, and realized I meant it completely. The packing and organizing intensified, but so did my sense of anticipation. I was really doing this. I was really starting over at 63, choosing adventure over familiarity. choosing possibility over the comfortable misery of waiting for people who might never prioritize me the way I'd always prioritized them. I arranged for movers, updated my address with the post office, and transferred my medical records to doctors in North Carolina. Each practical step felt like shedding an old skin and growing a new one. I also made a decision about how to handle my departure. I could have called each of my children and explained what was happening, given them a chance to object or try to talk me out of it. I could have made my moving day into a dramatic family crisis, with everyone rushing over to either help or protest. But that would have made my move about them, about their reactions and their feelings, and their attempts to control or influence my decisions. This move was about me, about choosing a life that made me happy rather than a life that kept other people comfortable. Instead, I decided to leave letters. Individual letters for each of my children, explaining my decision and my feelings without giving them the opportunity to argue or negotiate or make promises they wouldn't keep. Letters they could read and process in their own time, without putting me in the position of having to defend or justify my choice to prioritize my own happiness for once. Tori's letter was the hardest to write. She was my oldest, the one who'd been most involved in my life, even as that involvement had decreased over the past few years. "My dearest Tori," I began, "by the time you read this, I'll be starting a new chapter of my life in North Carolina. This isn't a decision I made lightly or quickly. For months, I've felt like I was disappearing from your life and your family's life, despite my best efforts to stay connected and involved. I know you love me, and I know you're busy with your own family and responsibilities. But I also know that I deserve relationships that are mutual and meaningful, not one-sided obligations that fit into your schedule when convenient. I wrote about the missed visits and the shortened phone calls, about feeling like I was bothering her every time I reached out, about the growing sense that my role in her life had shrunk to occasional check-ins and holiday obligations. I wrote about my new life in Asheville, about the community I was joining and the activities I was looking forward to. I wrote about how much I hoped she would visit me there, but also about how I wouldn't be waiting by the phone anymore, hoping for contact that might or might not come. "I'm not moving to punish you or to make a point," I continued. "I'm moving because I'm 63 years old, and I want to spend whatever years I have left feeling valued and connected and alive. I want to wake up each morning with plans and possibilities, not wondering if today might be the day one of my children remembers to call. I want to build friendships with people who are excited to spend time with me, not people who fit me in when they have nothing better to do." Thomas's letter was different. The physical distance between us had made our relationship feel more like a polite acquaintance than a mother-son bond, and I wrote about that honestly. "I know Phoenix is far away, and I know visits are expensive and complicated with work and family," I wrote. "But emotional distance isn't about geography. It's about effort and intention, and making someone feel like they matter. For the past 2 years, our relationship has felt like a monthly business call where we exchange updates but don't actually connect." I wrote about the times I'd suggested visiting him or having him visit me, about how those conversations always ended with vague promises to figure something out soon that never materialized. I wrote about watching him post photos on social media of family gatherings and vacations that I hadn't been invited to or even told about. I wrote about feeling like his wife's family had become his real family, while I had become an obligation he managed from a distance. "I don't expect you to drop everything and move closer to me," I continued. "But I do expect basic consideration and genuine effort if you want to have a relationship with me. Moving forward, I'm going to invest my emotional energy in relationships that are reciprocal. If you want to be part of my new life, you're welcome, but you'll have to show up in more than just name." Jennifer's letter was the most compassionate, but also the most firm. "My darling Jennifer, I know this past year has been incredibly difficult for you, and my heart breaks knowing how much pain you've been in. But I've also learned that I can't force someone to accept help or love or support. When I offered to be there for you during your divorce, to help with the kids or just to listen, you chose to handle things alone. I respect that choice, but I also can't keep trying to be the mother you don't seem to want or need. I wrote about understanding depression and isolation, about recognizing that sometimes people push away the ones they love most. But I also wrote about my own needs, about the fact that being shut out by someone I wanted desperately to help was its own kind of heartbreak. I'll always be your mother, and I'll always love you, I concluded. But I can't keep being the mother who waits endlessly for her children to let her back into their lives. I'm building a new life where I'm surrounded by people who want me around, not people who tolerate my presence when they can't avoid it. Each letter took hours to write, and by the time I finished all three, I was emotionally drained, but also strangely peaceful. I'd said everything I needed to say without anger or bitterness, but also without making excuses for their behavior or minimizing my own hurt. I'd been honest about my feelings and clear about my expectations going forward. Whether they understood or accepted my decision was up to them. The day before the movers came, I walked through my empty house one last time. 40 years of memories echoed in the bare rooms, birthday parties and homework sessions, Christmas mornings and graduation celebrations, the everyday moments of raising a family and building a life. But as I stood in the living room, where I'd spent so many evenings alone over the past year, I felt more excitement than sadness. This house had served its purpose. It had been the place where I raised my children and supported my family, but it was no longer the place where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. I placed the 3 letters on the kitchen counter, weighed down with a small vase that had belonged to my mother. Tori had a key to the house and would find them when she came to check on me after I inevitably failed to return her next phone call. The letters would explain everything, and then whatever happened next would be up to my children. The movers arrived at 8 in the morning, and by afternoon, everything I owned was loaded into a truck heading south. I followed in my car, watching my neighborhood disappear in the rearview mirror without a single backward glance. I was driving toward a future I'd chosen for myself, toward a community where my age was an asset rather than a limitation, toward a life where I mattered because of who I was, not because of who I'd given birth to decades ago. The drive to Asheville took 6 hours, and with every mile, I felt lighter. My phone rang twice during the trip, Tori calling, probably wondering why I hadn't returned her call from the day before. I let both calls go to voicemail. Tomorrow, she would find my letters and understand why I wasn't answering. Tonight, I was just a woman driving toward a new life, with the windows down and the music turned up loud enough to drown out any doubts or second thoughts. I arrived at my new condo as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed designed specifically to welcome me home. The moving truck was already there, and the crew was ready to unload my belongings into a space that felt full of possibility rather than weighed down by disappointment. My new neighbors, a couple named Helen and Robert who lived next door, came out to introduce themselves and offer help. Within an hour, I was surrounded by people who were genuinely excited to meet me, who asked questions because they were interested in the answers, who treated my arrival like a celebration rather than an interruption. That night, I sat on my new porch with a glass of wine, looking out at mountains I'd never seen before and listening to sounds I'd never heard. My phone had been buzzing regularly. Tori had obviously found the letters, and the family crisis I'd anticipated was beginning. But for the first time in years, their crisis didn't feel like my emergency. Their panic didn't automatically become my problem to solve. I read their increasingly frantic text messages with a detached sort of interest, like I was reading about someone else's family drama. "Mum, What is this? Why didn't you tell us you were moving? From Tori. Are you having some kind of breakdown? From Thomas. Please call me back. I'm really worried about you. From Jennifer. Each message was exactly what I'd expected. Shock, concern, attempts to make my decision about their feelings rather than about my life. They were experiencing their first real consequence for taking me for granted, and they didn't know how to handle it. I turned off my phone and went to bed in my new bedroom, in a house where no one had ever disappointed me or made me feel invisible. Tomorrow, I would start building the life I wanted. I would join the book club Helen had told me about and sign up for the hiking group that met every Wednesday morning. I would explore my new town and make new friends, and maybe even go on dates with men who were also starting over, who understood that 63 was not an ending, but a beginning. My children would adjust to this new reality, or they wouldn't. They would make the effort to rebuild our relationships on more equal terms, or they would continue to take me for granted and discover that I was no longer available to be taken for granted. Either outcome was acceptable to me, because I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own happiness to maintain relationships with people who didn't value my presence in their lives. 3 days into my new life, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Tori, and she sounded like she'd been crying. Mum, I found your letters. I can't believe you just left like that. We need to talk. Her voice carried all the emotions I'd expected: hurt, anger, confusion, and underneath it all, the dawning realization that her mother was not who she'd thought she was. I was not the endlessly patient, endlessly available woman who would wait forever for whatever scraps of attention her children were willing to offer. We are talking, I replied calmly, sitting on my porch with my morning coffee and watching my new neighbors walk their dogs. What did you want to discuss? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She'd probably expected me to immediately apologize, to explain my behavior, to reassure her that I wasn't really angry and that everything could go back to the way it was. Instead, I was treating this like any other conversation, which in many ways it was. I want to discuss why you felt like you had to move across the country without telling anyone, she said. And I could hear the accusation in her voice, the assumption that I'd done something wrong that needed to be justified. I didn't move across the country, I corrected. I moved to North Carolina, which is about 5 hours from where you live, and I explained my reasons quite clearly in my letter. Did you read it? The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Tori tried every approach she could think of: anger, guilt, bargaining, appeals to my role as a grandmother, reminders of family loyalty. She accused me of being selfish and dramatic. She suggested I was having some kind of mental health crisis. She promised that things would be different, that they would visit more often, that they hadn't realized how neglected I'd been feeling. But I'd heard all of this before, in different contexts and for different reasons. I'd heard these promises when I'd expressed hurt about missed holidays or forgotten birthdays. I'd heard these reassurances when I'd tried to talk to them about feeling lonely or disconnected. The difference was that now I was no longer desperate to believe them, no longer willing to accept promises in place of actual change. Tori, I said, when she finally ran out of arguments, I love you very much, but I'm not interested in discussing whether my decision was right or wrong. I'm 63 years old, and I'm perfectly capable of deciding where I want to live and how I want to spend my time. If you want to be part of my new life, you're welcome to visit me here. If you want to rebuild our relationship, I'm open to that. But it will have to be a real relationship, not the one-sided obligation it had become. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, less certain. I didn't realize... I knew we hadn't been seeing each other as much lately, but I didn't think... She trailed off, And I realized she was finally understanding the magnitude of what had happened, the depth of the loneliness and frustration that had driven me to such a drastic decision. "I know you didn't think about it," I said gently. "That's exactly the problem. I became invisible in your life, and you didn't even notice it was happening. The honesty was painful but necessary. We could build something new, but only if we were both willing to acknowledge how broken the old relationship had become." Thomas called that afternoon, and his conversation was similar, but with his own variations. He was angry that I'd moved closer to Tori than to him, interpreting my choice of location as favoritism rather than practicality. He was offended that I'd criticized his efforts to maintain our relationship, pointing out that long-distance relationships were naturally more difficult. He seemed to think that a monthly phone call and occasional video chat were adequate expressions of love and connection. "Thomas," I interrupted when he started listing all the reasons why his contact with me had been limited. "I'm not interested in relitigating the past or debating whether your efforts were sufficient. They weren't sufficient for me, and that's all that matters. I'm not asking you to justify your choices. I'm just telling you the consequences of those choices." His tone shifted, becoming more vulnerable. "Mom, I never meant to hurt you. I know I should have called more, should have made more effort to visit. But I thought you understood how crazy things are here, how demanding work has been, how much Lisa's family needs us too." And there it was, the assumption that I would always understand, always be patient, always accept whatever level of attention they were willing to give. "I did understand," I replied. "I understood for months and months. I made excuses for you to myself, told myself you were just busy, convinced myself that you still cared even though you rarely showed it. But understanding your circumstances doesn't mean I have to accept being neglected indefinitely. It doesn't mean I have to keep waiting for you to have time for your mother." Jennifer's call came last, and it was the most honest of the three. She was crying before she even said hello, and her first words were, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I pushed you away when you tried to help me. I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter when you matter more than almost anyone in my life." Her raw emotion hit me differently than her siblings' defensive anger or bargaining attempts. "Jenny," I said, using the nickname I'd called her since childhood, "I know you're going through something terrible with the divorce. I know depression makes everything harder, including accepting help from people who love you. But that doesn't change the fact that I spent months feeling shut out and unwanted. It doesn't change the fact that when I offered to be there for you, you chose to suffer alone rather than let me help." She sobbed quietly for a moment before responding. "I know. I know I hurt you. And I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix it. I was so angry about everything falling apart in my life, and I took it out on everyone who cared about me. But I never wanted you to leave. I never wanted you to feel like we don't need you." Her words were more genuine than anything I'd heard from Tori or Thomas, but they also highlighted the fundamental problem that had driven me away. "Needing me and wanting me are different things," I explained. "For too long, I felt like all three of you needed me when it was convenient, when you needed a babysitter or someone to listen to your problems or help with something. But you didn't actually want me in your lives. You didn't want to spend time with me just because you enjoyed my company. You didn't want to include me in your celebrations or your everyday moments. I became someone you called when you needed something, not someone you called because you missed me." The distinction seemed to hit her hard, and her crying intensified. "That's not— I mean, I do miss you. I do. I missed you so much during the divorce. But I was so ashamed of how my life was falling apart. I didn't want you to see me like that. Didn't want to burden you with my problems." The irony was painful. She'd been protecting me from her problems while I'd been desperate to help her through them, and in the process, we'd both ended up more isolated and hurt than we needed to be. Jennifer, I'm your mother. Your problems are never a burden to me. Helping you through difficult times isn't something I do because I have to. It's something I want to do because I love you. But you have to let me help. You have to let me be part of your life, even when it's messy and difficult. I paused, looking out at the mountains that were already becoming familiar and comforting. The offer is still open, by the way. If you want support through this divorce, if you want someone to talk to or help with the kids, I'm here. But I'm here in North Carolina now, building a life that makes me happy. You're welcome to be part of it, but only if you actually want to be, not because you feel obligated. Over the following weeks, my 3 children each processed my move in their own ways. Tori was the most persistent in trying to convince me to come back, calling every few days with new arguments about why I belonged closer to family, why the grandchildren needed their grandmother nearby, why my new life was selfish and impractical. She seemed unable to accept that I might actually be happier without constant access to her family, that I might prefer building new relationships over maintaining increasingly strained old ones. The kids keep asking when Grandma Eleanor is coming home. She told me, during one particularly manipulative conversation, Sophie made you a drawing, and Jake scored 2 goals in his last game and wanted to call you right after. But then I had to explain that you moved away, and we don't know when we'll see you again. Each word was carefully chosen to maximize guilt and paint me as the villain in my grandchildren's story. Tori, I said firmly, the children are asking when I'm coming home because you told them I moved away instead of explaining that I moved to a beautiful place where they're always welcome to visit. You could have framed this as an exciting new adventure, a new place for family vacations and special visits. Instead, you chose to make it sound like I abandoned them. That's your choice. But don't blame me for the consequences of how you decided to handle the situation. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult we'd ever had. Tori accused me of caring more about my own happiness than about my family. I pointed out that caring about my own happiness didn't mean I'd stopped caring about them, and that a grandmother who was fulfilled and happy would be a better presence in their lives than one who was lonely and resentful. She argued that grandparents were supposed to sacrifice for their families. I reminded her that I'd been sacrificing for 40 years, and that it was reasonable for me to prioritize my own needs now that my children were grown adults with their own families. You're being incredibly selfish, she finally said, and I realized that was the crux of our disagreement. In her mind, mothers and grandmothers were supposed to be endlessly selfless, always available, always willing to put everyone else's needs ahead of their own. The idea that I might have needs and desires that didn't revolve around serving her family was genuinely shocking to her. Yes, I agreed calmly, I am being selfish. After 40 years of putting everyone else first, I'm finally putting myself first. I'm sorry if that's uncomfortable for you, but I'm not sorry for doing it. The line went quiet, and when Tori spoke again, her voice was cold and distant. Fine. If that's how you want to be, then fine. But don't expect us to come running every time you decide you miss us. Don't expect us to rearrange our lives to fit your new adventure. Her words were meant to hurt, to make me realize what I was losing by choosing myself over them. Instead, they confirmed that I'd made exactly the right decision. Thomas took a different approach, trying to turn my move into something that benefited him. Actually, Mom, this might work out well for all of us, he said during one of our calls. North Carolina is closer to Phoenix than Pennsylvania was. Maybe we'll actually see each other more now that you're not tied down to that big house. His optimism felt hollow, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me that my move was actually good news for our relationship. But when I suggested specific dates for him to visit, or offered to come to Phoenix to meet him halfway, he reverted to the same vague promises and scheduling conflicts that had characterized our relationship for the past 2 years. Soon, and definitely, and let me check with Lisa and get back to you. All the same non-committal responses that had driven me to move in the first place. Thomas wanted the idea of a closer relationship with his mother, but he wasn't willing to do the actual work required to build one. Jennifer surprised me by being the first to actually visit. 3 weeks after my move, she called and asked if she could drive down with her kids for a long weekend. "I know I don't deserve it after how I've treated you," she said, "but I really need to see you. I need to see that you're okay, and I need to try to start fixing what I broke between us." Her humility and directness were exactly what I'd been hoping to hear from all 3 of my children. The visit was everything I'd hoped family time could be again. Jennifer was still struggling with her divorce and dealing with depression, but she was also making a genuine effort to reconnect with me. She asked about my new life, my new friends, my plans for the future. She seemed genuinely interested in hearing about the book club I'd joined and the hiking group I'd started going to twice a week. She asked thoughtful questions about my decision to move and listened without judgment when I explained how lonely and invisible I'd felt in my old life. Her children, my grandchildren, were initially shy in my new environment, but by the second day they were treating my condo like a second home. We baked cookies in my new kitchen and took walks on the community trails and had movie nights with popcorn and hot chocolate. For the first time in over a year, I felt like a grandmother again, not because I was providing free babysitting or emergency help, but because someone had made the effort to include me in their lives. "I want to do this more often," Jennifer said on their last evening, as we sat on my porch watching her kids play in the community garden. "I want to bring them here for school breaks and summer visits. I want this to be a place they remember as special, not just somewhere Grandma moved to get away from us." Her words showed that she understood why I'd left and was committed to making sure our future relationship was different from what we'd had before. "That would make me very happy," I told her honestly, "but only if it's what you really want, not what you think you should want. I don't need pity visits or guilt-driven phone calls. I need genuine connection, or I'd rather have honest distance." She nodded seriously, and I could see that she was thinking about what genuine connection would require from her. 6 months after my move, I was settling into a routine that felt more fulfilling than anything I'd experienced in years. My mornings started with coffee on the porch and a walk through the community with Helen and Robert, my next-door neighbors who had become genuine friends. 3 days a week, I participated in the hiking group, exploring mountain trails with people who appreciated both my company and my pace. Tuesday evenings were book club meetings, where we discussed everything from contemporary fiction to biographies, and I found myself contributing to conversations in ways that felt intellectually stimulating and socially satisfying. I'd also started volunteering at the local literacy centre, helping adults learn to read. The work was meaningful and challenging, requiring patience and creativity and giving me a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for longer than I cared to admit. My students came from all backgrounds and age groups, and working with them reminded me that learning and growing didn't stop at any particular age. I was good at this work, good at breaking down complex concepts and encouraging people who felt frustrated or embarrassed about their struggles. Most surprisingly, I'd started dating. A man named William, a retired teacher who'd moved to Asheville from Michigan after his wife died 3 years earlier, had asked me to dinner after we'd struck up a conversation at the community center. Our first date had led to a second, then a third, and now we were seeing each other regularly without any of the pressure or expectations that had characterized my marriage decades earlier. We were both independent people who enjoyed each other's company, but didn't need each other in the desperate, clinging way that sometimes happens when people are afraid of being alone. William had his own children and grandchildren scattered across the country, and his relationship with them sounded remarkably similar to what mine had been before my move. "They love me," he said, during one of our conversations about family. "But they love me the way people love a piece of furniture that's been in the family for generations. Important in theory, but easy to ignore in practice unless something goes wrong." His insight into the particular loneliness of older parents resonated deeply with my own experience. Tori had visited once, and the visit had been strained and uncomfortable for everyone involved. She'd spent most of the weekend making passive-aggressive comments about my new lifestyle and questioning whether I was really happy or just pretending to be happy to prove a point. She'd been polite to my new friends, but dismissive of my activities, treating everything from the book club to the hiking group as silly distractions rather than meaningful pursuits. "This doesn't seem like you, Mum," she'd said on her last morning, looking around my condo with obvious disapproval. "All this socializing and joining groups and going on dates. When did you become someone who needs so much attention?" Her words revealed everything I needed to know about how she saw me. Not as a person with my own interests and desires, but as a mother-shaped object whose purpose was to be available for her family's needs. "This has always been me," I'd replied. "You just never bothered to find out who I was beyond being your mother." The truth of that statement hung between us like smoke, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Tori had known me for 38 years, but she'd never seen me as anything other than a supporting character in her own story. Thomas had not visited at all, though he'd talked about it frequently during our phone calls. "I really want to see your new place, Mom," he'd say, followed immediately by explanations about work demands and family obligations and financial constraints that made travel impossible. His enthusiasm was always genuine in the moment, but it never translated into actual plans or booked flights. I'd stopped suggesting dates or offering to help with travel expenses, and our conversations had settled into a comfortable but distant routine of monthly check-ins. Jennifer, however, had become a regular visitor, bringing her children every 6 to 8 weeks and staying in close contact between visits. She was rebuilding her life after her divorce, and our relationship was becoming something we'd never had before. A genuine friendship between two adults who happened to be mother and daughter. She asked for my advice about dating and career decisions, and I shared details about my own new romance and social activities. We talked about books and politics and parenting strategies, conversations that felt intellectually satisfying rather than merely obligatory. "I think I understand now why you had to leave," she told me during one of her visits, as we sat in the community garden watching her kids play on the playground. "You weren't just unhappy about not seeing us enough. You were unhappy about not being seen as a whole person. We all treated you like you existed just for us, like you didn't have any desires or needs that weren't related to being our mother." Her insight was exactly right, and hearing her articulate it felt like a validation I hadn't realized I needed. "That's exactly it," I agreed. "I love being your mother, and I love being a grandmother. But I'm also a woman with my own interests and friendships and romantic possibilities. I'm someone who enjoys intellectual stimulation and physical challenges and new experiences. For too long, none of you seemed interested in any of those aspects of who I am." We were sitting in comfortable silence when her phone rang. It was Tori, calling to coordinate some family event I wasn't being included in. I listened to Jennifer's side of the conversation with detached interest, noting how Tori automatically assumed I wouldn't be available or interested in participating. "Actually," Jennifer said, interrupting her sister's planning, "I think we should ask Mom if she wants to join us. And before you say she's too far away, remember that she's chosen to live far away partly because we stopped treating her like family. The conversation that followed was tense, with Tori clearly frustrated that Jennifer was challenging the family's unspoken agreement to work around my absence, rather than addressing it directly. But Jennifer held her ground, insisting that if they wanted to maintain relationships with me, they needed to actually include me in family decisions and events, not just assume I was no longer part of their lives. Tori thinks I'm taking your side against her, Jennifer told me after she hung up. She thinks you've somehow turned me against the rest of the family. The accusation was both ridiculous and revealing. Tori couldn't imagine that Jennifer might have her own reasons for wanting a better relationship with her mother, so she had to believe I was manipulating the situation somehow. "You're not taking sides," I assured her. "You're just deciding what kind of relationship you want to have with me, independent of what your siblings choose. That's exactly what adults should do." But I could see that Jennifer was struggling with the family dynamics my move had created, caught between her desire to reconnect with me and her loyalty to siblings who saw my newfound happiness as a criticism of their behavior. A year after my move, I received an unexpected letter from Tori. Not an email or a text message, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the postal service. The formality felt significant, like she'd chosen this method because she needed to say things that required more thought and care than a phone conversation would allow. "Dear Mom," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about our relationship and about why your move upset me so much. I think I was angry because it forced me to realize how much I'd taken you for granted and how little effort I'd been making to include you in our lives. It was easier to be angry at you for leaving than to admit that I'd given you good reasons to leave." The letter continued for 3 pages, with Tori acknowledging specific instances where she'd prioritized other things over spending time with me, where she'd made assumptions about my availability without considering my feelings, where she'd treated me more like a service provider than like a person with my own needs and desires. Her words were honest and humble, in a way our phone conversations had never been. "I know I can't undo the past year, and I know I can't promise that everything will be perfect going forward," she wrote. "But I want to try to rebuild our relationship if you're willing. Not the old relationship where you were always giving and I was always taking, but something more equal and mutual. I want to know about your new life and your new friends and this man you're dating that Jennifer told me about. I want to visit you in North Carolina and see why you love it there so much. I want my children to know their grandmother as a person, not just as someone who used to live nearby and send birthday cards." The letter ended with a concrete proposal: a family vacation in Asheville, with all 3 of my children and their families coming to visit me for a long weekend. "I know we haven't all been together in over 2 years," Tori wrote, "and I know that's mostly my fault for always having reasons why family gatherings wouldn't work. But I'd like to try again, in your new home, on your terms, if you're willing to have us." I read the letter 3 times before setting it aside and going for a walk to think. Tori's words felt genuine, but I'd heard apologies and promises from all 3 of my children before, usually followed by a brief period of increased attention that gradually faded back into the old patterns of neglect and assumption. The difference this time was that the consequences of reverting to old behaviors would be more obvious and immediate. I was no longer sitting in my old house, waiting for phone calls and making excuses for their absence. I was living a full and satisfying life that would continue with or without their participation. I called Tori that evening and told her I'd received her letter and appreciated her honesty. "I'm willing to try again," I said, "but with some ground rules. If you commit to coming for this family weekend, you actually have to come. No last-minute cancellations, no shortened visits, because something more important comes up. If you say you want to be part of my life here, you have to show genuine interest in the life I've built, not just tolerate it while you wait for me to come back to Pennsylvania." She agreed immediately, almost eagerly, and we spent the next hour planning the logistics of a visit that would include all three of my children and their families for the first time since before my move. The conversation felt different from our usual interactions, more collaborative, more respectful of my opinions and preferences. Tori asked about my community and my activities with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "Mum," she said as our conversation was winding down, "can I ask you something? Are you happier now? I mean, really happier, not just trying to prove a point." Her question caught me off guard with its directness and vulnerability. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "I'm genuinely happier than I've been in years. I wake up every morning with things to look forward to, people to see, activities that challenge and fulfill me. I feel valued and appreciated and interesting again. I feel like myself again, not just like someone's mother or grandmother." She was quiet for a moment before responding. "I'm glad. I mean, I wish it hadn't taken something this drastic to make it happen, but I'm glad you're happy, and I'm sorry it took me this long to ask." Her words carried a weight of understanding that hadn't been there in our previous conversations, a recognition that my happiness was valuable in its own right, not just as it related to my availability to her family. The family weekend happened 6 weeks later, and it was everything I'd hoped it could be, and also everything I'd feared it might be. Jennifer and her children arrived first, comfortable and familiar with my new environment. Thomas and his family flew in from Phoenix, with the kids excited about their first trip to the mountains, and Lisa making polite conversation about how beautiful North Carolina was. Tori's family arrived last, with the adults slightly overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity, but the children immediately drawn to the community playground and the promise of hiking trails. For 3 days, my condo was full of the chaos and laughter I remembered from family gatherings years ago, but with a different dynamic than we'd ever had before. Instead of me organizing everything and accommodating everyone else's preferences, we made decisions collectively. Instead of the adults talking about me like I wasn't there, they asked direct questions about my life and listened to the answers. Instead of treating my new home like a temporary stop before returning to real life, they engaged with my community and met my friends and showed genuine interest in understanding why I'd chosen this place. The weekend wasn't perfect. Tori struggled with seeing me as an independent person rather than as their mother, who happened to be temporarily living somewhere else. Thomas seemed surprised by how social and active I'd become, as if he'd never considered that I might be capable of making friends and pursuing hobbies. But overall, the visit felt like the beginning of something new, rather than an attempt to recreate something old. "I can see why you love it here," Tori told me on their last morning, as we sat on my porch drinking coffee while the rest of the family finished packing. "It really is beautiful, and everyone seems so friendly. I guess I expected it to feel more like you were hiding out or punishing us, but it actually feels like you're thriving." Her admission surprised me with its honesty and lack of defensiveness. "I am thriving," I confirmed. "And I hope you can see that my thriving doesn't mean I love any of you less. It just means I've learned to love myself more." She nodded, and for the first time since my move, I saw genuine understanding in her eyes rather than hurt or anger. Thomas was characteristically less direct in his observations, but he spent considerable time talking with William, who had joined us for dinner one evening. "He seems like a good guy, Mom," Thomas said as we were saying goodbye. "I'm glad you're not alone out here." His approval felt both unnecessary and touching. I didn't need his permission to date, but I was pleased that he could see William as a positive addition to my life rather than as a replacement for the family relationships I'd supposedly abandoned. 2 years after my move, I can honestly say that leaving Pennsylvania was the best decision I've made in decades. My life in Asheville is rich and varied and fulfilling in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I have genuine friendships with people who value my company and seek out my opinions. I have interests and activities that challenge me intellectually and physically. I have a romantic relationship based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation or convenience. My relationships with my children have evolved in different directions. Jennifer has become my closest family connection, visiting regularly and maintaining frequent contact between visits. Our relationship has deepened beyond the traditional mother-daughter dynamic to include genuine friendship and mutual support. She asks for my advice about major decisions, and I share details about my own life that I might once have kept private to maintain the illusion that mothers don't have personal lives independent of their children. Tori and I have found a workable middle ground, though our relationship remains more formal and careful than I'd prefer. She makes genuine efforts to stay in touch and to include me in family events, but there's still an underlying tension between her desire to have me back in my old role and my insistence on maintaining my independence. Her children visit me regularly now, and I've become the grandmother who takes them on adventures rather than the one who babysits them out of obligation. Thomas remains the most distant of my children, though our relationship has improved from its low point. We talk regularly, and he's visited twice more since that first family weekend. But the physical distance between us feels symbolic of an emotional distance that predates my move to North Carolina. He loves me, and I love him, but we've never found the easy intimacy that characterizes my relationships with his sisters. The most significant change in my life, beyond the improved family relationships, has been my relationship with William. What started as casual dating has evolved into something deeper and more committed, though we've both been careful to maintain our independence and separate living situations. At our ages, we're not interested in merging our lives completely, but we've found joy in sharing many aspects of our daily routines and long-term plans. I never thought I'd fall in love again at 65, I told Jennifer during one of our phone conversations. I thought that part of my life was over when your father died. But William has shown me that emotional intimacy and physical affection don't have expiration dates, that two people can create something new and meaningful even when they're both carrying the history and wisdom of full lives lived before they met each other. My children have had varying reactions to my relationship with William. Jennifer is genuinely happy for me and has developed her own friendship with him during her visits. Tori is polite, but clearly uncomfortable with the idea of her mother as a romantic being, though she's made efforts to include William in family events. Thomas seems to view the relationship as evidence that I'm successfully managing my life independently, which appears to relieve him of any guilt about our limited contact. The broader lesson of these past 2 years has been about the difference between relationships based on obligation and relationships based on genuine mutual affection. My old life was built around obligations. Obligations to be available whenever my children needed me. Obligations to prioritize their needs over my own. Obligations to accept whatever level of attention they were willing to give. My new life is built around choices. Choosing to spend time with people who value my company. Choosing activities that fulfill me personally. Choosing to invest my emotional energy in relationships that give as much as they take. Some people might view my decision to move away from my children as selfish or extreme. They might argue that family relationships require sacrifice and patience, that I should have continued trying to bridge the growing distance between us rather than creating even more distance through my move. But I've learned that sacrifice without reciprocity isn't noble. It's just self-destructive. Patience without any expectation of change isn't virtuous. It's just acceptance of mistreatment. My move to North Carolina wasn't about punishing my children or teaching them a lesson, though it certainly had those effects. It was about recognizing that I deserved relationships that made me feel valued and appreciated, and that if my existing relationships couldn't provide that, I needed to create space for new ones that could. It was about choosing growth over stagnation, possibility over resignation, active happiness over passive martyrdom. If I could go back and handle the situation differently, I'm not sure I would. The dramatic nature of my departure created the shock necessary to break us all out of patterns that had been deteriorating for years. A more gradual approach might have been easier for everyone emotionally, but it also might not have been effective in creating real change. Sometimes relationships need to be completely disrupted before they can be rebuilt on healthier foundations. The phone call where Tori said, "We'll visit you soon," feels like it happened to a different person in a different lifetime. That woman who hung up the phone in her empty kitchen, staring at unstamped birthday cards and unfilled bird feeders, was trapped in a life that had slowly shrunk around her until she'd almost disappeared entirely. The woman I am now, sitting on my porch in the North Carolina mountains, planning a hiking trip with friends and a dinner date with the man I love, is someone I'd almost forgotten I could be. My children learned that I was capable of choosing myself over them, and that lesson changed everything about how they related to me. They learned that my love for them didn't mean I would accept being taken for granted indefinitely. They learned that being a mother and grandmother was an important part of my identity, but not the only part, and that I had needs and desires that extended beyond serving their families. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to choose happiness over habit, fulfillment over familiarity, genuine connection over obligatory contact. I learned that saying, "I deserve better than this," isn't selfish, it's necessary. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who take you for granted is to stop being available to be taken for granted. Today, when my phone rings, it's usually someone who's genuinely excited to talk to me. When I make plans with people, they show up because they want to be there, not because they feel obligated. When I share good news or struggles, I'm met with authentic interest and support rather than distracted politeness. This is what relationships should feel like at any age, and I'm grateful I had the courage to demand it for myself. The woman who once said, "Of course, sweetheart, I understand completely," while feeling completely misunderstood, has been replaced by someone who says, "That doesn't work for me," when something genuinely doesn't work. The woman who made excuses for other people's lack of effort has been replaced by someone who recognizes effort when she sees it and appreciates it accordingly. The woman who waited for other people to remember she existed has been replaced by someone who builds a life so interesting and fulfilling that people want to be part of it. They said they'd visit me soon. 6 months later, I moved without telling them where. 2 years after that, I can say with complete certainty that it was the best decision I ever made. Not because it hurt them, though it did, and not because it taught them a lesson, though it did that too. It was the best decision I ever made because it gave me back myself. And once you've remembered who you are beyond your relationships to other people, you can never go back to being less than that again.